Are you able to hear me? Yeah, okay. Because there's a little bit of some fluke here in Zoom. But anyway, Vishe'eno Nishar, we're now on Daf Nun Beis Amid Beis, Lo Yimotze. Meaning that the pasuk seems to indicate in the parsha of Chatas Ha'of that if Hanishar Badam, there's something left after the Hazoyos, and there's remnants in the dam in the oath, then you do mitzvah adam. But the implication is that she'eno nishar, if in event that all the dam from the neck of the animal of the bird was taken out already, then lo yimotze. You don't need mitzvah. There's no obligation of mitzvah. So that would certainly indicate that mitzvah adam is not ma'akev. So how can you tell me that Rabbi Shmuel holds, as Rav Papa insisted, that Mitzi Adam and Achatas Sof is Ma'akiv? Here you see explicitly in the name of Rabbi Shmuel that Mitzi Adam is not Ma'akiv, and he's Medaikid from the Pasuk. And the Gemara answers, Trei Tanoia al Liba de Rabbi Shmuel. So this is really interesting. We now have, if we look at the whole sugya, the whole picture, we have a double machlokas about Rabbi Shmuel. One machlokas is going to be between Rav Papa and Rav Ada bar Ava as to whether Rabbi Yishmael would say that Shvichas Dam al Yisod in the case of Chatos Behema is Likuva, whereas Rav Ada says yes and Rav Papa says no. And now, even within Rabbi Yishmael, we're going to have two transmissions as to what Rabbi Shmuel himself, Machlokas Tanoim now, as to what Rabbi Shmuel holds with regard to Mitzi Dam Chatas Ha'of, whether it's Likuv or not. Okay. Now we're going to continue our discussion regarding Shvicha Shirayim of Chatas Behema, whether it's Likuva or not. And the Gemara is now going to quote Rami Bar Chama on the second line here. And the Gemara is going to try to prove that there is such a brisa that establishes a Tana that holds that Shvicha Shirayim of Achatas HaBehema is Likuva. Now, this brisa that we're about to learn, Rabbi Rochama Hai Tana Savar Shiyayim Akvi Desanya, etc. Rabbi Rochama quotes this brisa, is a long-winded, complicated brisa, and I'm going to say a shir malos to ask Hashem to help us weave our way through, navigate through this brisa, and the proof of Rami Bar Chama will only come at the very end. Okay, so what is this brisa talking about? We have two categories of chatos. We have chatos chitzonios and chatos pnimios. Now, the brisa first describes the halacha of a chatos chitzona. And again, we're talking about a behema now. And the brisa begins with a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Vav, which has an extra word in it, osa, that seems to indicate a mute, osa, and not something else. Hakohen hamachateh osa yochlena. Now, in the case of a chatos, as we said a million times over and over again, the basar is nechal lezichrei kuhuna. And specifically, the rights to eat the basar are designated by the Torah to the Kohen who does the avodah. The word hamachata means the zrika. So the Kohen does the zrika, and then he's allowed to eat the basar of the karban chatas behem. However, hamachate seems to indicate that the entire mitzvah of zrika was fulfilled to the T, kilchasa, meaning that the dam was placed on all four chronos of the Mizbeach HaChitzoni. Now, what does the word osa come to exclude? Osa shenitan doma lamala, velo shenitan doma lamata. We'll try to explain. We've seen in the past that there's something called a chut hasikra, which is a red chevel that's sort of like a gartel around the middle of the mizbeach, and separates as a mechitza between the elyon and the tachton. Now, the elyon is called nitan doma lamala, and the tachton, which means on the lower part of the mizbeach, below the chut hasakra, on the bottom half of it, that's called doma nitan lamata. Now the question is, in the case of a korban chatos, which requires that the four matanos should be lamala, means on the kronos and the mizbeach. The kronos and the mizbeach, by definition, are lamala. They're on the very top of the mizbeach. And now the Kohen went ahead, and instead of doing the avodas hazrika on the top, on the kronos, he went ahead and he did it on the bottom half of the mizbeach. And in such a case, the Kohen forfeits his right to eat the basar. But what that means on a more profound level is that the korban is posel. So just to summarize, we're going to derive from this pasuk that in the case of a chatos, if the zrikas hadam was done lemata, the korban is posel. Amrit, the Brisa asks, v'chi me'ayin basa. In other words, you need this drasha of osa, the extra word osa, to derive the conclusion that if the zrikas dam hachatos was done lemata, the korban is posel. What was your havamina that you needed a drasha? What would be the logic that would dictate that it would be kosher? After all, we know that the mitzvah of chatos is to put the dam on the kronos hamizbeach. Okay, Beis Shammai say 2, and Beis Hillel says 1, whatever it might be. But if there was no dam that was nizrak on the kronos hamizbeach, then for sure it's possible. So how could you have a havamina to say that there might be a hechsher korban if the dam was placed below the chut hasikul lamata? And the Brisa answers. Michlal shenemar, v'dam zochecho yishofech al mizbeach Hashem Elokecha v'abasa teyochel. Right, that was the pasuk that we saw in the past in Dvarim Perak Yud Beis, which means that the dam of a chatos has to be placed on the mizbeach. Lamadato l'nitanim b'matan arba, she'imna son b'matan achas kiper. In other words, it says in the pasuk v'dam zvochecha yishofech. Yishafech indicates one shficha, which means that if you gave the matana on one of the 4 kronos, is the shita of Beis Hillel, then that's enough to clinch the kapara. Even though the other 3 nisinos he omitted. So that means that he didn't really do the full-fledged avoda of the arba kronos hamizbeach, of the arba matanos. And one matana is critical and clinches the kapara. So once the Torah offered that kula, that even though the mitzvah generates an obligation for 4 kronos, but the korban is valid post facto if he only did one matana on one of the 4 kronos, is yachal. I might think that if the Torah was mekil with regard to the chatos, then afani tonim lemalash and esonim lemata kiper. Right? If the kaparas hakarban is not totally contingent on the matanos on the 4 kronos, then maybe the Torah would have also been mekil to say that even if he didn't do any of the matanos on the kronos of the mizbeach, not even one, and all the dam was placed lamata on the outside of the mizbeach below the chut hasikra, I might think that it's kippur. Kippur means that the korban is kosher, and therefore I need a drasha, as we saw at the beginning of this brisa, of osa v'lo shenita dam lamata. And the brisa is not satisfied with this. I don't need any pasuk to teach me that the dam of a chatos lemata is pasul without any matana lemala. V'dinu, I can derive that from a kal v'chomer. How so? Okay, so now we have to reiterate what we know about chatas ha'of as opposed to chatas behema. Chatas ha'of requires that the dam reach the lower part of the mizbeach, lemata. Is nemru damim lemala, right? In the case of a chatas behema, the Torah requires lemala michut hasikra, that the dam be placed on the kronos of the mizbeach, v'nemru. But in the case of chatas ha'of, the Torah says the matanas damim are lemata, on the bottom half of the mizbeach, below the chut hasikra. Is then we should equate the two, and ma damim amurim lamata shenesana lamalo kiper. If in the case of a chatas ha'of, instead of doing the dam on the bottom half of the mizbeach, he did it on the top, then lo niskaper, lo kiper. There's no kapara. The korban is pasul. Is af damim hamurim lamala im nesana lamata lo kiper. So once again, I'm stuck with the question: why do I need a drasha of osa to exclude a case where he did the damim of a chatas behema lamata? I know that a chatas behema has to be lamala, and that's likuva, because I know that in the case of chatas ha'of, which requires dam lamata, if he put the dam lamala, the korban is pasul. And therefore, by virtue of analogy, I'm going to say the same thing applies to a chatas behema, just in the opposite direction, where he put the dam lamata. Certainly, the korban is pasul. Why I need the extra miut of osa? Look, you can't base any logical proof on the requirement of lamata in the case of chatas ha'of, because chatas ha'of has nothing lamala, never, ever, ever. It's purely lamata. Not so in the case of chatas behema. In the case of chatas behema, there's also lamala, which is the zrika, the matadamim lamala, but there's also lamata in the case of shvicha shirayim al yisod. Now let's argue, for the time being, that shvicha shirayim, in the case of a chatas behema, is likuva, which you remember, according to Ravad Barava, was the shita of Rabbi Shmuel, and now that shita is going to be reflected according to Rabbi Bar Chama in this brisa. So now we see that shvicha shirayim is an essential part of the avodas hadam. So therefore, in the case of chatos behema, we have not only an avodah of dam lemala, but we also have an avodah dam lemata, and that avodah of shvicha shirayim al yisod is part and parcel of the avodah of a korban chatos. Im amarta b'tachtonim shenitom lemala. In the case of a chatas ha'of, if instead of doing the matana lemata, and all the matanas are lemata, he did it lemala, then it's possible, because ein sofan lemala, there's no possibility of taking the dam of chatas ha'of and putting it lemala above the chut hasikra. And therefore, lo keeper. Now I understand very well that if he went ahead and he did the matan damim of the chatas ha'of lemala, it's invalid. Tomar, does that prove anything about a chatas behema? that bolyonim shenesan lamata sheyesh b'mehem karv lamata, that some of the dam has to be put lamata on the bottom, namely what? Through shvicha shirayim al yisod. So therefore I could have a havamina, and this will justify why I need the miyud of osa, that maybe if he didn't do a thing lamala, but he in the katas behema, he did everything lamata, maybe it would be kosher. Because the Torah does require lamata in chatas behema with regard to shirayim. I gotta take a breath here of air. It's just okay. Now the brisa is going to introduce another element, another carbon into the equation, and that's chatos pnimis. In the case of a chatos pnimis, the nesinas hadam has to be done on the mizbach hazav in the heichal bifnim. If he went ahead and he did the nesinas hadam on the mizbeach hachitzon, then the carbon is possible. Why not apply the same logic? That since the shvicha shirayim, even in the case of a chatas pnimis, has to be done on the mizbach hachitzon, therefore, if he did all his rikos and all the matanos instead of on the mizbach hazov, he did it on the mizbeach hanachosh, then it should be kosher, and that's not so. Domim apnimim yochichu. I'll prove to you that even though there's something called sofan lamata does not facilitate a validity, a validation of the carbon if he didn't do the carbon the way he was supposed to do, the avodah the way he was supposed to do it. Sheyesh ma'im karv lachutz, right? The shirayim of a chatas pnimis has to be poured on the yisod mizbeach bachutz. V'im noslan betchila bachutz, if he did all the hazoyos of all the matanos in the mizbeach achitzon bachutz, low kippur, there's no kapara. The carbon is invalid. So don't tell me that since there is going to be a shvicha shirayim later on, lamata, therefore I would think that in the case of a chatas chitzona, if he did all the avodah lamata, it would be kosher. There's no such havamina. And we're back to square one. We still don't understand how to justify the drasha, the miyud of osa. Look. So the Brisa now says that chatas pnimis is not a proof. And this is the part of the Brisa that's most challenging. So we ask Hashem for help. Because there's going to be a phrase in this Brisa with a havamin in the Gemara, and then the Gemara is going to reject that interpretation of that phrase. What is that phrase? Im amarto bidomim hapnimim. So again, we're talking about a chatas pnimis. And if the dam was done on the outside, it's possible. Ein mizbeach hapnimi memarkon. What does that phrase mean? Ein mizbeach hapnimi memarkon. Memarkon usually means to complete the process. And as if to say that the avoda inside, meaning in the heichal or in the Kodesh Kadoshim, is not complete. There's one avoda that has to be added in order to complete the carbon. So let me just try to throw out a possibility. I should really wait till later, but I'm just afraid we'll run out of time. I think what the Gemara understands now in the phrase "Ein mizbeach hapnimi mamarkon" is that you need shvicha shirayim, even in the case of a chatas pnimis, outside on the Yesod Mizbach Ha'ola, Mizbach HaChitzoni. And that's called Ein Mizbech HaPnimi Memarkon. So even though we have two Mizbachos, we got the Mizbech HaZov where you're going to do the Matan Domim, but nevertheless you also need a Matan Domim, so to speak, in a loose sense, on the Mizbech HaChitzoni, the outer Mizbech, namely Shvicha Shirayim al Yesod Mizbech HaChitzoni. And at this point, we think that the Brisa is telling me that a Chatas Pnimis is more Chamur because it needs both Mizbachos, which I'll tell you the truth is counterintuitive. Because the fact that you can do the Miruk, meaning the final part of the Avoda on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, namely Shvicha Shirayim, that I think would be a Kula, but now we're understanding the Brisa to be a Chumrah. And in this case, if the Avodas Hadam was not done properly, Bimkomon, in its right place, then the carbon is possible. So there's an extra chumrah over here. Tomar Bel Yonim, would there be a havamina to say that in the case of a chatas chitzona, and Bel Yonim mean you put the dam, you should have put the dam, I should say, on the top part of the Mizbeach, namely on the Kronos, and Hare Kronos Mimarkos Osan. Now, there's no need to an additional matan domim like there is in the case of a chatas pnimis. So, in that sense, a chatas chitzona relative to a chatas pnimis is kal. It's more lenient. Now, if that be the case, then in nisana lemata ksherim. No, I'm sorry, ksherim before the drasha, meaning if not for the pasuk osa, I would have a svara to say that although in the case of a chatas pnimis, if you don't do the avodah b'mkoma, it passes the korban. In the case of chatas chitzona, which is more kal, because all the avodah is done on the mizbeach hachitzon, it's not split and it doesn't require another mizbeach hapnimi, is how much more is therefore. I'm sorry. Not how much more, so I'll leave out that. Is therefore, I might think that maybe if he did the avodah lamata, it would be kosher. Talmud lomar osa shteim domim lamala, shenita dom lamala v'lo shenita dom lamata. Okay, so this was Rami Bar Chama and the back and forth in the Brisa. And now Rami Bar Chama has to come back and tell me what did he prove from this brisa. And he says, Rami Bar Chama, what does the brisa mean? She'ein mizbeach hapnimi mamarkom lav elu shirayim. That the avodas hadam of a chatas pnimis is not complete on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, because you need the Shvichas Shirayim on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Now, that would only make sense, says Rabbi Bar Chama, if the Shvichas Shirayim on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, in the case of Chatas Pnimis, is Likuva. It's absolutely critical. And therefore, it's part of the Avodah. And if it's part of the Avodah, then the Avodas Dam requires both the Mizbeach HaPnimi and the Mizbeach HaChitzon in the case of Shvichas Dam, which is part of the Avodas Adam, which means that it's Ma'akev. If, on the other hand, says Rabbi Bar Chama, you would argue that Shvichas Dam al Ha-Yesod is not Ma'akev, then why would the Brisa say She'ein Mizbeach HaPnimi Mamarkon? If it's not Ma'akev, and it's not critical to do the Avodas Adam outside of the Heichal, meaning Shvichas Shirayim al Yisod, then how can you tell me that Ein Mizbeach HaPnimi Mamarkon? Mizbeach HaPnimi is Mamarek. It completes the whole process, and the Kaporas HaKarban and the efficacy of the Karban is clinched with the Mizbeach HaPnimi. Amalei Rava, and Rava wants to reject this interpretation of the Brisa and come up with a different understanding of Mizbeach HaPnimi Ein Mamarkon. If you're right, Rami Bar Chama, that what the Brisa wants to tell you when it says Ein Mizbeach HaPnimi Mamarkon is that the Shirayim on the Mizbeach HaChitzon is Likuva, then the whole Brisa makes no sense. Why? Teisei b'kal v'chomer. Ma Shirayim HaPnimiyim shesofan chova b'chutz. The meaning Shvichas Shirayim on the Mizbeach HaChitzon is an obligation, because Shirayim is ma'akvin according to you, Rami Bar Chama, and nevertheless, in Mason b'tchila b'chutz lo kiper. Nevertheless, if the Matonas Adam, which is the Iker Carbon, was done on the Mizbeach HaChitzon and not on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, then the carbon is possible, and that's even in the case of a Chatas Pnimis, where there is an avoda bachutz, which according to you, Rabbi Bar Chama, is absolutely akuva, and yet if he didn't do the tchilas avoda inside the mizbeach hazav, it's possible. Is therefore, in the case of chatas chitzona, hanitanim lemala she'ein sofen chota lamata, because everybody agrees in the case of a chatas chitzona that shvichas dam al yisod is not likuva. Vasan b'tchila l'matay din shelo kiper. I mean, how could you derive the conclusion that for sure, if he did the avoda lamata, that it's not valid? I mean, the logic of the brisa is just off kilter. So let's just go over it once more. What Rav is claiming is that, according to you, Rami Bar Chama, that Shvichas Shirayim in the case of a Chatas Pnimis is Likuva, which means that the Avodas Adam is going to be completed outside, and yet you need its Avodah B'mkoma inside before you get to the Shirayim. And how much more so in the case of Chatas Chitzona, where the Torah was makil and said that Shvichas Shirayim is not Likuv, and nobody argues about that, then Asan B'tchil Lamata, how do you know it's Lo Kiper? Ella. So let's see what we can fit in the next, how many minutes do we have here? 2 minutes officially, but let's see. We just want to get Rava and understand Rava's understanding of this brisa. Ein Mizbeach HaPnimi Memarkon doesn't mean that you need Shvichas Shirayim in the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Ein Mizbeach Pnimi Memarkon Bilvad Ela Paroches. Right now we're talking about Lifnai V'Lifnim, that you need Hazoya on the paroches, that's going to be the first hazoya, where the Kohen is standing in the heichal and he does the hazoyos in the direction of the paroches. So now you need, number one, hazoya al paroches, and number two, you need hazoya al hamizbeach. And therefore, since there are two avodos that have to be done bifnim, if you do them bachutz, meaning if you do it shalom koman, then it passes the carbon. And therefore, you can't derive any conclusion here to chatas chitzonos, where there's only one avodas dam, and that's the avodah hachitzona. How would you know, therefore, that in the case of chatas chitzona shelo bimkoma, which means that if he did it lamata instead of lamala, that the carbon would be possible? The carbon is possible in the case of chatas pnimis because the Torah requires two different avodos bifnim. But in the case of chitzona, where there's only one avoda, it's quite possible, therefore, that if he messes up on that avodah and instead of doing it lamala, he does it lamata, maybe the carbon would be kosher. Don't draw any conclusions from the chumrah of a chatas pnimis, which is more lechumrah. And that's how Rava ends this whole discussion, but it has nothing to do, claims Rava, with whether shirayim or ma'akvim. Because when it says here, Eina Mizbeach Pnimi Mamarkon, it doesn't have to do with the shirayim in the Mizbeach Achitzon. That's not the discussion here in this brisa. The discussion is about the fact that you have two different avodos that are done inside. And that's the chumrah of achatas pnimis, which precludes any kind of hechsher akarbon in a case of shalom b'mkomon. But in the case of achatas chitzona, it's very possible, where the Torah only requires one avodas hadam, that maybe the Torah would say that even if there's a shinui makom and you didn't do the zrikas hadam b'mkomon, it still might be kosher. And that leads us here to Tanu Rabbanon on the bottom of Nun Beis Amid Beis. But I think we should leave this for tomorrow, even though it's going to mean that we're a little bit behind, but we'll try to make